So, as you may know, there have been a lot of people talking about Vengeant Cascade, this notable here over on the far right of the tree. Increase projectile speed, attack projectiles return to you, and returning projectiles pierce all targets. This is most of the reason why golden oils are currently like 60 chaos each at the moment. Getting any amulet with this notable on it is extremely expensive, and the reason for that is that it is kind of busted. Now, there have been a few people in my Discord talking about this, and apparently there was like a Reddit thread a little while ago, and I had been thinking about how Vengeant Cascade and the new changes to it would work with the steel skills, and this was something that I wanted to test this league. Now, if we look at splitting steel here, you'll notice that it says modifiers to number of projectiles instead apply to the number of targets projectiles split towards. And it says projectile split towards 5 targets, and it can split without hitting a target. So the whole idea here is that with Vengeant Cascade in, the way that splitting steel works is a little bit different than normal. So we attack, and you'll notice that all of the projectiles come back to my character. So the idea here is that since every single one of these projectiles is coming back to my character, any splits are essentially an additional hit, as long as the enemy that we're hitting is large enough. So if I am standing directly on top of whatever enemy it is, and my projectile split, you'll notice that there is a pretty sizable overlap between the AoE on all of these abilities. So what this means is that if your splitting steel has 10 additional projectiles, it is hitting 10 additional times. Now, this can be compounded quite a bit by using Sniper's Mark. If you notice, it says projectiles which hit cursed enemies split towards 5 additional targets. Now, with some help from modifiers on the tree, you can get this all the way up to 6 additional targets with increased mark effect, and that means that we're getting like 15 to 16 additional hits with splitting steel, putting us well over like 2000% damage effectiveness. That is if every single projectile is hitting. Now, there's a bit of a conundrum because I just jumped on my old steel champ. I have like 4 of them at this point. This was probably the most geared steel champ that I had, and I was thinking about the Savior and Paradoxica and such, and the problem here with particularly the Savior, we can jump into any map and I can show you this here. So I'll just jump in this random white tier 15. The purpose here is not to show you the damage of the build. You should mostly ignore the damage here when we're going to be showing this because this character is insanely geared. It should absolutely destroy pretty much anything. But the whole idea here is that when I proc the boys, when I proc the reflections from the Savior, the issue is that the reflections have their kind of own like location, that when the projectiles come back, you'll notice that it goes back to them, right? So that's kind of the problem here, is that since the Savior clones are going to be moving their projectile back towards where they are, that means the vast majority of those projectiles that they're shooting out aren't actually going to be hitting a boss, because they kind of just go wherever they want, right? They don't really care too much about where you're standing. They kind of just run around and do their thing. Now, I think a decent amount of them will probably hit, but as you can see, all their projectiles are going back to them. So this brings up a problem. If all those projectiles are going back to them, and we are specifically using splitting steel, does that make the Savior the best weapon for this build? And I think the answer might be no. Now, I'm going to be leveling a new character for this in the new league with all the new stuff and the new crucible trees and all that kind of stuff, and we'll be testing this because if the Savior isn't the best weapon, that means that most likely a crafted two-handed weapon is going to be the best weapon, and that could potentially lead to some pretty insane things, especially with the new crucible trees that we've got. I was tossing around a POB with some people on stream, and as you can see down here in the bottom, if you are looking at the damage numbers, it's like 143 million or something like that. I don't know how accurate these damage numbers are, and this is with a lot of gear. This is a pretty insane amount of gear, but this is also with like 100,000 evasion, 100,000 armor. Shout out to Phoenixia for this tree, by the way. It's a pretty crazy amount of gear, but that's a pretty serious amount of damage, and that's with a sword like this. Now, this sword is deceptively easy to craft, and I do need to do a little bit work on figuring out exactly how to craft this sword. However, from what I can tell, we're going to be doing some absolutely insane damage potentially here, and yeah, splitting steel seems pretty busted potentially with Vengeant Cascade. Now, I kind of want to just show you a little bit, so we're going to run into just a random tier 16 white Drox map. I'm not going to roll anything on this because this is not like a damage showcase. You should not be taking any of the damage that you see here as legitimate whatsoever. This is just my old steel character using splitting steel and a ton of gear, right? Like, this is a lot of gear, so do keep that in mind. However, this character isn't set up properly for splitting steel. Like, I don't have the tree set up properly specifically to make use of splitting steel. I actually have awakened greater multiple projectiles, which is bad right now. We don't want those additional projectiles because the less percentage on all the projectiles is probably worse. So there is a lot of issues with the current setup. So it's a lot of gear, but there's also problems. So I don't think the damage here is legitimate either way. It could be more, could be less. I really don't genuinely know. However, I want to show you what it looks like when we do eventually find the boss, because this is potentially a new age for steel skills if this is the case. Because one of the main pain points that I would say that steel skills have always had is that it's already a 2-button build, but having to swap gems for a single target, and the fact that splitting steel is so weak early on, that there isn't really much of a way for you to have like a comfortable play style in very low levels of gear. However, if you can get just Vengeant Cascade on any item whatsoever, like in any way, doesn't matter how you get it, with just like a random necklace in some way, then it's possible that you could probably clear a lot of stuff with just some Bell Timber Blades. Because Bell Timber Blades should work pretty well for this, because they give you far shot, and the projectiles, if you watch, are splitting out and then going back in. So they should hit max percentage of far shot, which means 60% more damage. And then Bell Timber Blade also, if you've used a movement skill recently, gives you 2 additional projectiles, which just scales perfectly with the way that we're wanting to do this. So there's a pretty sizable chance that this is just going to work like very well. Now you kind of see what I'm trying to get at here there, but let's do this on Drox. I just want you to watch the amount of projectiles that we've got here, okay? That's all I want you to watch. So if you see here, when we actually have, this is just the spirits, just the clones doing it. But here when we've got everything going, look at the amount of projectiles here. Like this is actually an absurd amount of projectiles that we've got going at any given time. Like it's basically the entire screen, right? Now, with all of this together, with a build that actually is like making use of it properly and has like the correct links and maybe even a 2-hand, because I think the savior clones might be a overall damage down if they are not standing on top of the boss. However, I do think they are regardless a damage up for clear. So I think that probably early on with only a little bit of gear, you'd probably go savior and maybe 1 Bell Timber Blade. Maybe a Paradoxica, I really don't know. Paradoxica is super expensive, and I'm wondering if a Bell Timber Blade, a single one, is just going to be better because of far shot. I'm not 100% certain on that, but there is potential that that is the case. It's going to take a lot more testing. It's going to take a lot more time, but I kind of wanted to at least give you guys an idea, because this is a really cool mechanic. And I'm going to be pushing to see how much we can scale specifically splitting steel, because it would be really nice to not have to worry about lancing steel anymore, because it's kind of an annoying ability to use most of the time. Because one big problem with lancing steel in particular is the fact that you can only cast this a couple of times before you have to rip the steel shards back out. So the problem here is that if we go up to max steel shards, which is 12, we can only cast this 3 times, right? Now you'll see that these projectiles are coming back to us as well, so lancing steel can make use of this also. However, we can only cast this 3 times, so in realistic scenarios, that POB DPS that you see just isn't really accurate, right? However, it's a lot easier if we only have to do that every 12 times, right? So we can cast 12 times and have all of these projectiles overlap until we have to, you know, like pull the steel shards back out of the enemy. So with all this together, there's potential for Steel Champ to be an absolutely insanely smooth build with some pretty easy early game, because Bell Timber Blades typically aren't too expensive early on, and they should be enough to carry you through a lot of the content. In the Reddit post, I did see some pretty basic gear showing numbers of like 15 to 20 million damage with some relatively cheap gear. It's not like super cheap. I'm talking about like 5 divine or 10 divine or so, but I mean, that's an insane amount of damage for so little gear. So I'm going to do some more testing. If you're curious to see how all of this goes, make sure to check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/bigducks. We will be streaming as often as I can, testing out this build, figuring out everything going on with the splitting steel champion, and seeing what we can do. I'm curious to see how this is going to perform at lower gear levels, how it's going to perform at super high gear levels, and crafting that 2-handed sword in the POB that I was talking about before, and seeing if we can get up to this like 100 million DPS craziness, because we might be able to use like the fledgling. I have to test a lot of stuff to get this amount of damage, to be honest with you, but this POB is pretty stacked. Once again, thanks to Phoenixia for this, but I mean, it's kind of insane, the potential that splitting steel might have in this patch. And this is before talking about crucible trees, because this isn't even capped on crit. Like, this character has 80% crit chance right now, and with crucible trees, among other things, there's some potential for us to be able to cap crit. And if we capped crit, I mean, we would just be doing 20% overall more damage. A lot of crazy stuff. There's a lot of potential for this. So I'm hoping that we can get some pretty crazy stuff going with the Steel Champ. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, I'm super excited about this because I would really like to see Steel Champ back in the spotlight. It is one of my favorite builds of all time. And even though they did nerf the lower end of some of the steel skills, they buffed the higher end of splitting steel by quite a bit. So, and there is an insane amount of potential for this to do some pretty serious damage. So remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in rank class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.